Perhaps you could tell us something about the Tang Music Project, then.
I regard this part of my work as the most important work of my life. When I first became interested in Chinese music, and when I was in China, I never thought there was any possibility of recovering any part of the repertory of music played at the Tang Court. The furthest back I could go was to songs of the Song Dynasty, composer and poet, musician Jiang Kui. Of his works, a collection of song texts, some of which had musical notation with them, were printed about 1202. The songs had all been written during the 12th century, and many of them were dated by him, and as is usual with Chinese lyrics, there is often a little prefatory note telling the circumstances under which they were written. And in two cases, he states that he's using a melody which he believed to be of Tang date. But that was the sum total of music that I possibly regarded as Tang. The sum total, at any rate, of secular music that might be regarded as of Tang date. The Confucian philosopher Zhu Xi had preserved 12 tunes for lyrics from the Book of Songs, which he believed to be of Tang date. He believed them to be 8th century, from the Kaiyuan reign period. But those, of course, were a very archaic style of Chinese melody, and it's very doubtful whether they were ever performed at all during the Tang period. I've never been able to find any reference to their performance. And then in 1953, Eta Hari Schneider, a German woman who had been taken on as a teacher in Western music by the court musicians in the palace in Tokyo, began publishing a number of papers on the condition of the Japanese court music. And among other branches of the court music, she talked about the so-called Tang music, Tongyaku, in Chinese Tang Yue. And the scores that she presented, her own transcriptions, bore no resemblance to any Chinese music that ever was. And of course the sound of the Tang music as performed by the court musicians is wholly dissimilar from any known Chinese music, and is so conspicuously dissonant that Chinese, on hearing it, refuse to believe there is any connection at all. But she published in the course of this article a photograph of a manuscript, and it was a type of manuscript in which the tablatures of the two instruments are shown in parallel, and the two instruments were the lute, the biwa, that is Chinese piba, and the mouth organ, Chinese sheng, Japanese sho. And I thought once that both of them were formally typical Chinese writing of melodies. And conspicuously, in the case of the mouth organ, there was nothing there but a melody. Whereas in Japanese hands, the mouth organ erects 5 or 6 note chords on every degree of the range of the instrument, as far as possible. And so this entire extraordinary shifting harmonic accompaniment as it appears in Tang music performance in Japan is in fact an extrapolation of a basic melody. And the same basic melody was present in the lute part, which again didn't look at all like what the Japanese make of the lute parts in performance nowadays. And when I managed to get hold of a copy of Johannes Müller's papers on the court musical instruments, in which he included plates representing the notations, the tablatures for each of the 5 melody instruments, it became quite clear that the ensemble was really a heterophonic ensemble with every instrument playing the tune, the same tune, in a different octave and playing it according to its own mechanical limitations. And all this became instantly clear way back in 1953. But at that time I knew no Japanese. Harry Schneider had thrown away her weight about rather. She produced a book on drum patterns in bungaku, that is to say the part of the Tang repertory that is still danced to. And this was in many respects such an extraordinary book that the then librarian Eric Kiedel and I, Kiedel had been senior lecturer in Japanese in the university, wrote a very critical review which was published in Music and Letters, extremely critical. She treated everybody else who'd ever written about Japanese music as quite hopeless and unworthy of examination at all. Everybody else, that is to say, except Müller, who had been physician to the emperor way back in 1870. And in particularly, she was very critical of Sir Francis Piggott, who wrote the first book on Japanese music, a very sympathetic account of music, and she was quite abusive about that, damning with faint praise and so on. Her translations of parts of the text she was dealing with left a great deal to be desired, and she constantly changed her romanization of the same Japanese text. So Kiedel and I were fairly unkind, and after about 4 years, this review, I gather, was brought to her attention in a rather unkind way. She maybe still is, a professor at the university in Vienna, and there were still plenty of ex or crypto Nazis about the place in the academic world there, and they pounced on this article with glee. She attempted to take Kiedel and myself to court. There was a long battle of the solicitors on either side, and finally she was dissuaded from so doing. She was told by her solicitor that she hadn't a leg to stand on, that it was fair comment on what she'd done. But to render justice to this woman, and I was astonished one day talking with Arthur Whaley when he said to me, "And do you have any news of the hairy spider?" And I said, "The hairy spider?" He said, "Yes, that's what you called her, Harry Schneider." And I had not the slightest recollection of having produced this perversion of her name. But of course, from a Freudian point of view, it was absolutely the fairest possible representation of my secret thoughts about her. Anyway, if she's still alive, God bless her, because she produced this photograph which really gave me the clue instantly. And I realized if only one could get the manuscripts, the probability was that one could get back to the original tunes borrowed from the tongue repertory. And I didn't do anything about this until I was moved definitively from zoology to Oriental Studies in 1966. And I was made an assistant director of research, bracket, Oriental music, bracket, in the Faculty of Oriental Studies, whereas I'd been assistant director of research, bracket, zoology, close bracket. It was in fact virtually the same post. The professor of zoology was just on the point of retiring. The incoming professor began to throw his weight about in a manner such as not customary for professors to indulge in Cambridge, and my old professor was made so furious by this that he decided to give my post to Oriental Studies. So zoology lost a post and Oriental Studies gained one. The reason for this being necessary was that before Thurston Dart took the chair of music in King's College London, he had, without previously talking to me about it, persuaded the Faculty Board of Music to seek a post for me in the Faculty of Music in Oriental music. And this had been agreed by the Faculty Board, but at the last minute they thought that it would be courteous to wait until Robin Orr arrived to take up the chair of music vacated by Thurston Dart. When Professor Orr arrived, he said he had other and more urgent teaching needs than an assistant directorship in Oriental music. And so there I was, no possibility of a post. At that point, Oriental Studies leapt into the breach, and especially the then Professor of Chinese, Edward Pulleybrag, and began to see what they could do about it. But of course, to persuade the General Board to produce a post in music where you would have an intake of 100 a year, say, and one could imagine that having courses in musical instruments on a worldwide base for the benefit of all incoming musicians and so forth was a very different proposal from having an appointment in Oriental Studies, where with a very much smaller undergraduate intake each year. And so it wasn't thought very probable that the General Board would create a post here. And then it was that my old professor in zoology handed over the post. And so that was really how I came to be safely seated in Oriental Studies. The building had in Sidgwick Avenue had just been completed, and to my delight and astonishment I found there was a room for me. And there were no students who wanted to do any research in Oriental musics, and so from 66 until 72, I was able to get on with my research and did an enormous amount of writing. And first of all, again through Keedle's kindness, I've been able to get hold of wind parts of the court music, going back really to the middle of the 19th century, but reprinted in the 30s. And I transcribed the mouth organ part of all the current repertory of about 60 pieces. And it was already clear to me that the mouth organ presented a much simpler version of the tunes than the flutes. The flute and the cylindrical double reed pipe have very much more decorated versions of the tunes, and so it looked as if one were in search of the tongue originals, it would be sensible to look first of all at the mouth organ scores. And the more I and other people have continued to look at the mouth organ scores, and the older the mouth organ scores we've been able to get hold of, the more it seems that we were absolutely right in deciding that the mouth organ really presented the most unchanged version of all the pieces available to us. It wasn't until 1971 or perhaps 69, quite suddenly, I was made aware of the existence for sale in a bookseller in Kyoto of a collection of Gangaku manuscripts of the various genres of the court repertoire, including a certain number of mouth organ manuscripts, but also manuscripts for all the instruments. These were brought to my attention by Elling-Ide, whom I've mentioned before. Professor Twitchett and an American professor were running a small symposium, a seminar, I suppose one would call it, on tongue studies, primarily historical and literary. And Dennis Twitchett, our then professor of Chinese, asked me if I would talk about the tongue repertoire, because I had already exhibited specimens of these tunes in the faculty. And Elling-Ide in particular was enormously taken by the tunes that had come out. They invited me to dinner in Sydney Sussex College, where the conference was housed. And after dinner, when they'd all had a fair amount to drink, on a keyed mouth organ, I played the tunes, and they had various things like ashtrays or newspapers to rub on this or that in order to produce friction, percussive effects, and the ashtrays and banging the tables in time of music and so on. And a very good time was had by all. And following this, I was invited to Yale to lecture on 2 occasions. But I was able, with a loan from Jesus College, to buy this collection from the bookseller in Kyoto. And it was perfectly evident to me as soon as I got my hands on a body of manuscripts covering the entire repertoire, and of all the melodic instruments, that the supposition about it being originally being a heterophonic ensemble was absolutely correct. And there was a lute manuscript of 16th century date among the others. And I knew that at that time the then Emperor Momoyama, this is the Momoyama period, had attempted a collation of all existing tongue music manuscripts, and I thought if only I could get to Japan, I might find a set of synchronous manuscripts of about that date. And so I gradually prepared for a study trip that would take me progressively across Asia to Japan, and planned to stay for 3 months working in Japanese libraries, going through catalogues, trying to pick out dated manuscripts for all the melodic instruments as early in time as I could. And this is what I did, and worked principally in Tokyo in the Palace Library, in Kyoto in the Kyoto University Library, and also in what was originally a very important private library, the Yome Bunko, which had important manuscripts of the tongue music. And I collected microfilms and photocopies of manuscripts, and came back to Cambridge. I'd like you to hear one of these tunes that came out from the mouth organ part at a very early stage in my work. A tune called literally the Vinous Sogdian. I wondered for a long time what this title really meant. I mean, shortening it is simply the wine barbarian, but we know that barbarians in Tang times were almost invariably Sogdians, and so it was clearly a Sogdian who had something to do with wine. But it was a fact that the Chinese were enormously intrigued by a great delight that the Sogdians took in drinking fermented grape juice, whereas, of course, in China, fermented grape juice, though it was known, was not the staple form of alcohol. They were accustomed to drinking either rice wine or rice spirit. It was the Japanese who discovered that this title refers to a puppet, a little mannequin that was dressed as a Sogdian and given the physical characteristics of one with blue eyes and a very prominent nose, possibly red hair, certainly fair hair, that was played with in the houses of prostitution in Chang'an, the town capital. And when the little mannequin fell over and pointed at you, you had to drink a full bowl of wine, and so it was very good for trade. And this is the origin of this. In Chinese, it's a very curious name to qualify a human being with what is normally used as a noun, simply the word wine, and that's why I use this rather peculiar term, the vinous Sogdian. And what I think is so remarkable here is that one immediately feels the appropriateness of the tune to its title and the circumstances. And it quite often happens in Chinese music today that if it were not for the words there, or the title, from the music itself, one would not immediately be able to judge what its affect was intended to be, whether it was very sad or happy or what. But in this case, there is a sort of Western certainty about the reference that this tune must have, and of course it comes from a country quite a distance to the west of the Chinese capital at that time, Chang'an. And I think also, of course, in the structure of the tune is so remarkable. It is almost classically Western in the way it's built up, from phrases of equal length, and in this respect again very different from most Chinese tunes, which are very often what we sometimes call durchkomponiert. They flow on without repetition. So here is the wine puppet. that was played about 1971 by undergraduates in Jesus College. For a time we were known as the Jesus College Chinese Band. And then when I, on my journey to Japan in '72, I visited Taiwan, and in Taipei I was in touch with Professor Zhuangwen Li, who has worked a lot on early Chinese musical instruments, and he was interested in my work on the Tang repertory, and he suggested that we give some of these tunes to a group of musicians with whom he was in touch for them to play. And I wrote out a copy of 9 different tunes in the numerical notation, which is commonly used by the Chinese for instruments. And all the performers were told was the title of the piece. And the group was led by a mouth organ player, a sheng player, and it included a zither, a lute, a horizontal and vertical flute, and a double reed, a cylindrical pipe, guanzi. And no information other than the title of the piece was given to the performers. So it was left to the sheng player, who was leading, to determine the pace. I asked that they should repeat the tune, and that in repeating they should, if they felt it suitable, that they should add decoration as they proceeded. This is a standard thing in Chinese urban popular music today. People will take any tune and embroider it freely, all the instruments doing their own thing. You have to be able to do that if you're a musician at all, and of course you would never use notation at any time. But on this occasion, as one couldn't let them learn the tune by ear, they used the numerical notation. And what delighted me was the balance of the ensemble, because I'd been worried about whether the lutes would really function as a bass in this ensemble, because of course the Japanese think of their performance under the influence of Western listeners as accompanied monody, the most important tune being that produced by the double reed cylindrical pipe, the hichiriki, and the rest of the instruments effectively producing a sort of chordal accompaniment to the melody of the reed pipe. But as you'll hear, it doesn't sound a bit like that. It is very clearly a heterophonic ensemble with the lute acting as a bass, and the lute's bass version of the tune coming through quite plainly in this performance. Agree that the Chinese obviously have absolutely the same kind of response to this tune as I and the students in Jesus College had. Well, when I got back from Japan, miraculously pupils began to present themselves who wanted to work with me. And the result of that was that for a while in Cambridge I had 5 students playing different instruments, Chinese instruments, who were able to take part in the ensemble, who could read the tablatures, could play from the tablatures without transcription, and whose job it was to produce transcriptions of the earliest tablatures available to us. And we have, for example, a 10th century flute manuscript that includes about between a third and a half of the repertory, and which must be very close to the Tang originals, because the definitive borrowing of music from the Tang court took place in 841, when the last mission to China for 300 years returned to Japan. The Tang dynasty was beginning to crumble, and the Japanese saw no point in sending further missions, and they didn't do so for 300 years. And gradually I began to get all these transcriptions together, and now am progressively publishing this entire repertory of about 140 items, some of which are large suites in several movements, so that in due course we'll have all that survives of the Tang entertainment music repertory published in transcription from the oldest surviving manuscripts. The manuscripts themselves, one can see these, for example, this is my oldest mouth organ manuscript. It can be dated at about 1200. This is one which is about a century later, written by a Chinese monk as a commission. This is zither tablature. This is a preface to the suite, part of the preface to the suite. This is its title. The Emperor Destroys the Formations, the music of the Emperor destroying the formations, and the formations are military formations. And then this is lute tablature. This is the end of the contents of the scroll, the last pieces. This is drinking wine. This is a playful handful, and this is martial virtue. And then here comes the Emperor Destroys the Formation, and part of the preface. This is the beginning of the processional, and this is the prelude, the music proper. This volume consists of one suite only, the largest suite that has survived, in two movements only, a prelude and then a quicker and measured movement in 6 sections. The prelude itself is not measured, but it is built up throughout in units, in binary units. One might call it tempo giusto senza misura, whereas the second movement is measured, or not always regularly in 6s, but on the whole measured in 6s throughout. And one of the remarkable things, this is an alternative version in the manuscript for zither top line and lute lower stave. And these are all musical glosses written into either the lute manuscript or the zither manuscript, and most of them go back to a century before the date of these two manuscripts. These were produced about 1171, And these annotations have references constantly to the Horikawa-in emperor, who was the emperor about a century before that date. And it is surely astonishing to see so much scholarship applied to musical manuscripts already in the 12th century. We didn't do anything like that in Europe until the 19th. On my way to Japan, I entered Afghanistan, coming from the Soviet Union, coming from Tashkent in fact, and I inquired of various people about toy instruments, sound producers used by children. I set myself limited objectives at all the ports of call on this journey out, and one thing that I'd discovered when working on the Turkish book was the existence of this children's subculture of sound producers, usually entirely unrelated to the adult instrumentarium and very often including extremely archaic instruments, once of cultic significance in the adult society. And I called on the director of the museum in Kabul, and he mentioned to me an instrument called Tipçe Bodane, or Tipçe Bodona, which he described as a little drum, and I couldn't really understand what it was he had in mind, but the information was there, and we went on to other things. He told me of little reed pipes, idioglottal reed pipes with upcut tongues, and he allowed me to see all the beadram ivories that the museum had, and these include many representations of instruments from the 6th or 7th century, and also there were stone figurines, and I was able to make drawings of all these things. I talked with servants in the hotel Srinagar about toys, and I had with me photographs of some of my Turkish children's toys, and they immediately produced parallels and made things for me. And someone had suggested that a good place to go to look for things would be a place called Istalif, which is of some interest because the name itself comes from Staphylon, which of course is Greek for the vine, and this was an important center of wine production in the days of Hellenistic Greek colonies in that area. I found a taxi driver outside the hotel who spoke some English. I think, in fact, the hotel found him for me, and I went off with him to Istalif, and very soon we were asking the villagers about all the things that children played with, and so on and so on. And he was absolutely indefatigable, and suddenly someone mentioned these magic words again, Tipçe Bodona, and produced this, first of all. And as you can imagine, I was terribly excited. And the driver knew that I wanted to buy this, and so he whispered to me, don't you do anything, you go away and I'll bargain. They produced two of them. One uses a sort of double thing, and the other is a single one. Well, the Bodana part is the word for quail, and this tipça is presumably a little drum. So what on earth is a little drum doing with dealing with quail? Well, the fields at certain seasons of the year are full of quail, and the villagers make these things, and they use them both to discover whether quail are there and also to attract quail. And this is a little whistle, and the little drum, this is a wooden spoon, of course, is converted. It becomes a pump effectively when you beat on the diaphragm, pulling the skin together over the bowl of the spoon. And this is a really marvelous device, enabling you to blow a whistle at very high frequency. It wouldn't be possible to whistle as rapidly as that. One couldn't produce that break in the sound simply by either a bilabial whistle, or even if you had a little tubular whistle to blow on. And this is simply a double-ended one in case one should break. When I was in Thailand, the one thing that I had set myself to do was to discover how the mouth organs are made. One gets in the Mekong Delta, among the Lao and among the Thai as well, very large mouth organs, fundamentally of the same kind as the mouth organs of China and Japan, but they are famous for producing a sound of very beautiful tone quality. And people have had rather curious ideas about how this comes about, a suggestion that they might be using silver reeds instead of bronze reeds and so on, not realizing, of course, that a silver reed would be quite hopeless because it wouldn't have any elasticity at all. But the difficulty was to know where to go to find mouth organs. I took advice about that. I went to the British Embassy in Bangkok, and I well remember hearing the cultural attaché speaking over the phone in my presence. "I have here an elderly British academic." At least I got advice that I should go to a small town called Khon Kaen in northeast Thailand, and I duly flew to Khon Kaen and set myself up in a hotel, and then went off into the street, and providentially within a few hundred yards I discovered a man selling mouth organs. They're called Ken, on the pavement. And so I got down by him on the pavement, hoping to be able to discover where he lived. And so I drew elaborate pictures of him and of me and of walking to his home and all the rest of it. It didn't produce any effect whatsoever. And then I looked up and there was a Chinese draper immediately behind us. And I went into the draper, but he spoke only Fujianhua from southeast China. And so then I wrote him a little note in terrible Chinese, asking if he'd be so kind as to inquire of this man what the name of his home village was. And he did so, and I found the name of his home village, which was Ban Sikyo. And I went back to the hotel. I didn't buy a mouth organ. I went back to the hotel, and I told the clerk at the desk that I would like to hire a taxi and an interpreter, and he produced both, and I went off to Ban Sikyo with this young man who was still at that time attached, I think, to some American Army group in Bangkok, and was used as an interpreter. And we arrived in Ban Sikyo, and I was taken to the home of two men, an elder and a younger, and the elder man's grandfather had also made mouth organs, and I explained through my splendid interpreter, Mr. Kamsi Otton, that I wanted to see, if possible, all the stages in the making of a mouth organ. And in a wonderfully obliging way, the senior and the younger did absolutely everything for me and showed me everything that they had. The bronze that they use for making the reeds in these mouth organs comes exclusively from the coinage, the bronze coinage of Chulalongkorn Rama V. It was minted about 1910. I was born in 1909. And quantities of these coins are collected whenever they turn up anywhere. They're taken off and melted in an adjoining village, which I didn't visit, and there they're rolled into sheets of metal of about 0.2 of a millimeter thick, I would say, and the villagers purchase such sheets, and then with this little cold chisel they cut the sheets up into strips that are about 3 to 4 millimeters wide, as you see here. The extraordinary thing is that this coinage of Chulalongkorn Rama V was minted either in Birmingham or in Hamburg. And its composition is very, very similar to the composition of our old pennies. When I brought this material back, I wrote to the Royal Mint to inquire about the copper coinage of Chulalongkorn Rama V. And it was the Secretary of the Mint who gave me this valuable information. And I persuaded a friend of mine in Jesus, Dr.Carole Pegg, to undertake a metallurgical examination, not only of the coin itself, but also of all the materials that are used in the making of reeds. And when they have these strips, they then hammer them out so that their breadth is increased somewhat, as you can see comparing these two. And of course they become much thinner, and they're hammered and kept cold all the while they're being hammered by having water dripped on the work. So they are cold worked to this thickness and produced in strips of about this length, and then with the same cold chisel they mark out slightly tapering tongues in the metal, and these are the future reeds, single beating reeds that they're going to use in making the mouth organs. It is a marvelous piece of technology with the simplest possible tools, and every stage in the preparation contributes to the mechanical properties of the reed, properties that are essential to its proper functioning in the mouth organ. I've described the whole business of the preparation of the reeds and the metallurgical aspects of their making and their physical properties in a paper with not only with Dr. Page but also with Dr. Atkins, who is a physicist very interested in the purely acoustic side of the properties of the reeds and of these mouth organs. The reeds are inserted in rectangular windows that are cut in the walls of lengths of bamboo. A particular bamboo, a particular species is used for this purpose, and its remarkable property is that the lengths between the nodes of the bamboo stems are very considerable, whereas many bamboos have comparatively short internodes. This particular bamboo has very long internodes. And also the canes are remarkably uniform in diameter. And these are imported by the villagers from Vientiane in Lao country. Culturally, these people in northeast Thailand are properly to be regarded as Lao, but they think of themselves as Thai, and of course they are to be referred to as Thai, but much of their musical equipment in songs and types of songs and so on has been shown to belong to Lao territory rather than to be strictly speaking Thai. The reeds are set into these rectangular windows by undercutting slightly at each end and pushing the reed in. And the most important point in the manufacture of these instruments that accounts for their extraordinarily beautiful tone is that the reeds are always inserted at a quarter of the distance from one end of the pipe. The pipes are open at both ends. The effect of inserting the reed in this position is to diminish the intensity, in particular of the fourth harmonic, but also of other adjacent harmonics in the total complex of sound that comes out of the pipe. And I had no idea what the significance of this was when I was in Thailand. It was Dr. Atkins who first pointed out to me that the effect of this is equivalent to the reed being inserted at a distance of an eighth of the wavelength of the sounding pipe, and that this will necessarily produce attenuation of certain of the lower harmonics. His acoustic examination of the properties of the pipes, and I brought back specimen pipes made by these two workers in Bansikyo, was that in fact the second harmonic is very strong in the note from a pipe. The adjoining harmonics, and in particular the fourth, is noticeably weakened in both the high pipes and the low pipes. And there is a cloud of high harmonics at relatively low intensity, forming a sort of haze round the prominent second harmonic. And it's this that accounts for the sweetness of sound altogether. It isn't anything to do with the chemical composition of the reed. It is due simply to the placing of the reed in this position along the pipe, always at a quarter of the distance from one end. Now, it isn't merely that the pipe is open both at its lower end and at its upper end. They're able to control the speaking length by cutting lateral windows in the pipe, and this allows them to assemble the pipes in a purely decorative way, which doesn't really necessarily reflect the real acoustic speaking length of the pipe. If one examines the mouth organ, one can see straight away the presence of this vent at the upper end of the pipe. But it wasn't until I saw the instrument, so to speak, coming into being in that house in Bansico that I realized that the lower end of the pipe also is laterally vented. And it is these two vents that determine the real speaking length of the pipe. I was puzzled as to what the effect of this lower vent was on the sound of the instrument. And through my interpreter, I asked what would happen if the lower vent were made still lower down the pipe, for example. And so they immediately cut another vent below, and one could hear at once that the sound had not only changed slightly in pitch, but also that it had become coarser in quality and more like an ordinary harmonica sound in the West, or more like a Chinese mouth organ, which doesn't have this sort of golden quality of sound that the Thai mouth organs have. The makers worked independently. An older man and a younger man started to make simultaneously two pipes. They were going to be an octave apart. They didn't measure anything. They inserted the reeds, and the elder man picked up the two pipes and put them together side by side over his mouth and blew the reed, and you couldn't hear that there was any beat about the octave at all. And I asked if they ever measured anything, and they produced this, which is a strip of bamboo with little steps cut at intervals. And while I got this in my hand, I said, and if I take this away, will you never be able to make another mouth organ? And of course they thought that was extremely funny. And I was assured that they could always start making the lowest pipe of all, and simply by judging tonal quality, doing the venting, getting the sound they want, they could be quite certain about the pitch because of their absolute sense of pitch, and all the rest of the pipes could be generated from this single bass pipe once made. I'm not quite sure now that that is really the whole story. It would be necessary to go back to Thailand and with a really efficient interpreter ask them about it again. Personally now, I don't think that they could do that without having some way of working out. Maybe they do it simply by ear. But if, from the point of view of measurements, they need more measurements than are available perhaps on this measure here, if they're going to be able to generate the whole series. But at least it's quite clear that they have, as a result of years of practice, an enormous fund of technical skill, so that they really don't have to measure things at all. Now, just to hear a little of this colloquy that took place on the ground floor of the house in Bansico, here are some of the, this is testing the pipes, and I'm asking them to separate the two so that I can hear one pipe sounding by itself. Only one. Only one. Would you blow it with that one closed? And now you should do the other one. No, not together. And again. And again. Once more. That's fine. And now if you do it with that one too. That's fine. Let's not again. He hasn't done more.
ไล่ไปทีละลูก
เราจะระลุจะระช่างจะทำ
โอ้ล่ะ Now, if you do it once again.